Welcome to this presentation that the whole world has been waiting for. This magical presentation will be called Hocus Pocus Focus. Yes, I will be going through some creative ways to use this new filter in Photoshop. To begin with, let's compare and contrast the difference between the lens blur filter and the everyday, normal Gaussian blur filter. To do that, I'm going up here to my window menu and down to Arrange and over to Tile. I'm going to tile two open images at this time so they look like this. Here, the topmost image is an example of the new lens blur filter on this eye chart. And here, the bottom image is an example of the same eye chart but blurred with the everyday standard Gaussian blur. I'm now going to zoom in here on the top image. I want to zoom in on this chart and go up to 100%. Then with my space bar key down, I'm going to move this down into position. Get ready, here comes the first super user tip and technique of this presentation. Up to the window menu, down to Arrange and over to Match, Zoom, and Location. That's right, we're going to match the zoom and location of this first image we have selected with any other image that is open. Of course, these images are of the same size, so they will zoom to the same point and position. Isn't that incredible? Now, let's compare and contrast. Again, here on the top image is the eye chart that has been blurred with the lens blur filter. And here on the bottom image, of course, is the image which is blurred with a regular everyday Gaussian blur. You can quickly see that there's more of a geometric shape here in the blur on the lens blur version than there is on this standard everyday Gaussian blur. That's one major difference. Another difference takes place here. I would like to scroll within these two images. Now it's time for super user tip number 2. To scroll between both of these images at the same time, I'm going to select here my hand tool, then select the Shift key from the keyboard. The combination of using both of these will allow me to scroll both individual images at the same time. You saw it here first. I'm now scrolling down until we come to this location. I want to point out a very interesting difference. Here in this chart that you see a series of dots. I'm going to turn off this top layer so we can see what the image looks like before the lens blur filter. You can see these dots, and now you see them blurred. Take note that highlights within this image are taking on the shape and the form of a pentagon. The pentagon was chosen in the dialog when the lens blur was applied to this image. You are thus recreating the effect of a true lens blur because the shape of the iris is then reflected in the highlights in this image. You can also see a slight pentagon forming here inside the counter of the O character. Very interesting. Now you know, and you can see for yourself in the comparison between these two files, there are some distinct differences. Let's close this and get on with our story. Here we have several images in the file browser. I'm going to use these images to demonstrate some creative ways to use this new lens blur filter. These images range from the very complex of examples to the very simple. Let's start with the simplest of these. Here in the upper right hand corner, I'm going to click on this image. Then I'm going to go up to the options bar and click on this icon to bring the file browser forward, and then once again to click it and close the file browser. In this first simple example, I want to adjust the depth of field using the lens blur filter. To do that, we have to create an alpha channel. And we're going to learn quickly that alpha channels are the secret to success when using the lens blur filter. I'll repeat that. Alpha channels are the secret to success. Now let's proceed. I'm moving over here to my Channels tab. I'm going to click that and bring that forward. I move down to the base of my Channels palette, click on the Create New Channel button, just like that. You of course start here with a black alpha channel. Here's a nice super user tip and technique. I'm going to turn on the visibility of my RGB image by clicking here, so I can see my image through my alpha channel. Then I want to place in a gradient instead of this solid black area. I'm going to move over to my gradient tool here from the tool palette, select that, and make sure that I've selected a foreground to background gradient here. Click outside, and also make sure that I have a default set of colors, black and white. Simply select your D key to shift to the default set of colors. Now, this is where it all starts. Listen carefully. The alpha channel, when used with the lens blur filter, looks for the gray values in the alpha channel and bases the focus on the gray values. So if I put in a gradient across this image, clicking here at the farthest distance from the camera with my gradient tool, then moving to the area closest to the camera here, I'm then assigning gray values to specific points of focus within my image. Now in this particular image, a gradient works quite well because black over here on the left will represent areas farthest from the camera, and over here on the right, represented by white, will be closest to the camera. You're starting to understand. Now that we have this gradient, let's turn off the visibility here so we can see the gradient. Now, if we did not like this gradient and we wanted to adjust it, remember you can use levels or curves on this gradient to make adjustments. Now let's go back here and click on our Layers tab. Then click on our image. It's now time to apply the filter. Going up here to the filter menu, down to blur and over to lens blur. Okay, here we are in the lens blur filter dialog. Keep in mind, you can adjust the size of this dialog by clicking in the lower right hand corner of this dialog and adjusting the size. Now this dialog is filled with adjustment possibilities, but in this first presentation I'm only going to focus in on a few of them. One of them is here, and it's the radius. By adjusting the radius, you then adjust the amount of blur across your image. The greater the value, the more blur. Now, what about that alpha channel I created? How are we going to use that? We're going to use that as a depth map. Now, first of all, I'm going to move the radius back down to 0, so there is no blur. Then I'm moving up here to the depth map, clicking on the source, which is currently set to none, and going down to alpha 1. Remember, that was the name of the alpha channel that was named for us by default. I'm going to select that. Now let's take a look at this, the blur focal distance. The best way to understand this is to think about this slider as representing the gray values in that gradient. So 0 in this case represents those pixels in the gradient which were black. And if I move this to the right, 255 represents those pixels which were white. So we can essentially assign the location along this gradient where we want the greatest amount of focus. Do you start to understand? So if I want the focus to be somewhere right about here in the gray values, I leave it there. Then I move my radius value up to blur the image, but the areas in this region will be protected from the blur because the equivalent gray value for this area of 158 is then protecting that area and makes it appear in focus. I can adjust the location of the focus point by moving this slider. But what's even better, I can move my cursor into the screen area and merely click here on this incredibly good-looking child's face, and then this child's face comes into focus. I am assigning the area of the mask by merely clicking on the image. So if I click down here in the region farthest from the camera, that area appears in focus. If I click back here, that area pops into focus, merely based on assigning what gray values will be used within the alpha channel mask. Now you're starting to understand. I'm now going to select cancel and move on to my next project, which is just a little bit more complex and may teach you some things you need to know. I'm going to close this image and go back to our file browser. Okay, let's now look at another creative way to work with the lens blur filter. I'm going to double click here on my flower garden image. Then I want to close my file browser up here in the options bar by clicking on that icon. So in this project, we want the flower to be in focus and the background to be out of focus. Fairly simple. We cannot use a gradient depth map as we did in the last project. In this case, we need something that's more black and white. In other words, over here in the channels palette, I'm going to click and reveal a channel that I've created earlier. Here, my flower mask. In this case, I've made the flower white and the background black. Let's use the lens blur filter and see what happens. Going back to my RGB image and back to layers and making sure I'm targeting the appropriate layer. Then up to filter and down to blur and over to lens blur. Okay, like we did before, let's set the depth map. Here, selecting the source of none and going down to the flower mask. Remember, that was the name of the alpha channel that I created earlier. With that set, we need to move into our image area and click on the flower. Watch the blur focal distance jump to 255, which would represent white. White in our mask will be assigned to be in focus. Then we move over here to our radius adjustment and increase the radius and thus make the background drop out of focus. Incredible. That's cool. Now in this particular project, let's do something extra. I'm going to zoom in on this area of the image right here. As you can see here, the flower still maintains its original texture and grain from the original digital image. But when we run the filter on the background to blur it, we're losing the original grain and texture. To put some of that back in and make this appear more realistic, I'm moving down here to noise. I'm going to run this slider up until I start to see an equivalent amount of noise in the background as I see in the foreground, the area that has not been blurred. I'm going to increase this based upon the amount of resolution in my image. I can choose between uniform and Gaussian or even monochromatic. Let's leave that where it is and click OK. Our final results would look like this. Amazing. Let's move on to our next project. I'm going to close this image and choose my next image from our file browser again. So now what does Mr. Brown have up his sleeve? Well, it's the Nancy and Alicia project. Double-clicking on this image, closing our file browser. Now in this project, as in the last project, we want to make the background drop out of focus and the foreground stay in focus. Yet there's a new twist to this. Let's take a look over here. If I blur this background as we did the last background, it would look like this. The background drops out and the foreground stays in focus. But what if we wanted to get yet a third level of focus? Something in between the trees and the foreground. To do that, it might look like this. Watch the fence posts here. There. I've added a little bit sharper focus to the fence posts behind our subjects. How did he do that? Well, let's take a look at our channels. Here I've created a few channels. This is what the channel would look like if I just had two levels of focus, the foreground and the background. But if I wanted multiple levels of focus, I would make a channel that looks like this. Notice my foreground is white, background is black, yet the fence posts here are gray. I've assigned them a third level so that they're not exactly totally out of focus and not exactly completely in focus, but this middle ground. So use this type of effect to create different planes of focus within your image. Let's go back to our image and review that one more time. So here's the normal image. Here's one plane in the foreground in focus, and then here's this third plane added in where the middle ground is slightly in focus. Could there be more? Of course. Let's close this image and move on. Here is another interesting project, the spiral staircase. In this project, I wanted to create an alpha channel that seemed to spiral down into the image. To do that, I'm going over to my channels palette here, and I've already created a gradient here, from the base here at black to white at the top. I'm now going to run a filter on this, a distortion filter of twirl. I'm going to zoom back out by clicking on this minus sign here so I can see the entire image. Then I'm going to move my angle of rotation here until I start to get a spiral that looks like the spiral staircase. Then I'm going to click OK. I want to superimpose my gradient spiral over the image. By clicking here on the visibility of the RGB layer, I can then see the two combined together. You can start to see the spiral mask going down into the image. Interesting. We go back to our RGB layer, back to our layers palette, and click on our image. Then, as before, under Filter, Blur, Lens Blur, we can go in and apply that alpha 1 source and then set our radius, and then in this case, clicking in the foreground, and thus we get this spiraling effect as it moves down the stairs. Cool! Is there more? Yes, there's one final demonstration. Let's cancel from that and close this. To finish this all off, let's go to this space blur, this final image here. This is the most complex of all of them. Imagine, if you will, you have a very sophisticated 3D rendering tool. And in the process of creating an illustration like this, you can also create channels, alpha channels generated by this tool. Here we have an alpha channel of just the asteroids. Notice the asteroids that are closest to us are one level of gray, and the asteroids that are the farthest away are another level of gray. This program would go through and create a gray alpha channel for each one of these layers. You then combine all of these together to create an alpha channel that looks like this. You then apply that alpha channel to the image in this fashion, selecting the target layer, filter, blur, lens blur. And as in the past, you target our mask here, lens blur channel, set the radius here, and then target the spaceship, because that's what we want to be in focus. Then you get this beautiful sense of 3 dimensions as the asteroids get more and more blurry into the distance and are sharper here in the foreground. You can go through and adjust your blur distance, your radius, and all of your other controls. The one thing else I'd like to show you is this. I'm going to click OK. It's blurred our image. I'm going to do one last thing to finish this presentation off completely, and that's this effect. Under the Edit menu, select Fade Lens Blur. This is great. By adjusting the opacity between the original image and the blurred image, I can bring back some of the star pattern in the background, just slightly, but still maintain the blur quality and the dimensions that the lens blur gave me. So it's a combination of lens blur plus fade lens blur that really gives me nice results. I'm going to click OK. So there you've seen a series of incredible ways to use this new lens blur filter. Remember, the secret to success is creating the perfect alpha channel in combination with the lens blur filter.